Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on governance for Academy trusts. I'm Hugh Swainson, I'm a partner in Buzzacott's charity not-for-profit team, and with me talking today is Alison Pyle and Catherine Biscoe, both from the same team. But let's begin, and I'm going to hand over now to Alison to start.
Thank you, Hugh. So I'm starting off with some scene setting. What is it that dictates the governance of an Academy Trust? And there are numerous documents here that are relevant from the public sector, from the education sector, and from a charity's perspective as well. So moving on to my first slide. So this slide sets out the role of the board as defined by the Department for Education. The DfE has a governance handbook that was last updated in October 2020. And within there, the DfE identifies 3 core functions for the governing board to fulfill. So the first of these is ensuring the clarity of vision and ethos and strategic direction of the trust. So this covers the overall aims and objectives of your Academy Trust. The second core function is holding the executive leaders, i.e. the senior leadership team, to account for the educational performance of the trust and also the performance management of staff members. So that includes the broader staff members, but particularly the senior leadership team and their performance. And thirdly, overseeing the financial performance of the organisation. So this includes making sure that financial controls are in place and operating effectively, and making sure that the trust's money is well spent, i.e. value for money. And this is one of the areas that we will focus in on more detail later on. Moving on to the second slide. So moving on, we're going to look at the various different regulators involved in the governance for an Academy Trust. So starting with the DfE via the ESFA, that's really the key body here, being the principal regulator. But because Academy Trusts are also exempt charities, they also have to comply with charity law as regulated by the Charity Commission. The Charity Commission has a lot of guidance in the area of governance, and a lot of that does overlap with the DfE's guidance. In addition, as companies limited by guarantee, trusts must also comply with company law and the filing requirements of Companies House. And finally, on the education side, you have Ofsted regulating the educational and safeguarding side. So as governors of an Academy Trust, it's really key that you understand the requirements of all these different regulators, particularly relating to the governance of the trust. Moving on to the next slide. So we're now going to look in more detail at the Charity Governance Code. So this is not specifically applicable to Academy Trusts, and nor is it designed for an educational organisation. Nevertheless, many of the themes within the Charity Governance Code are very applicable to an Academy Trust, and a lot of the themes that we see coming through here are in other guidance documents and are referred to, for example, in the Academy Trust Handbook. So the terminology that you see here, you will see repeated elsewhere. So the Charity Governance Code was set up by a charity sector steering group. It's not mandatory for charities to follow it, but it does give some really useful guidance around the themes of governance for charitable organisations. It was updated fairly recently. In that update, point 6 was expanded on. That used to be diversity, and it's now equality, diversity and inclusion. So there's a bit more focus in that area. And the update also expanded on point 3 around integrity. So looking at in a bit more depth at all of these areas and the things that the board should be thinking about in its governance. The first point, the organisational purpose. So this is the vision, ethos, the aims and purpose, and the having a strategic plan with agreed outcomes. So that really ties back to that first core function that the DfE identified on the previous slide. The second area is leadership. So this emphasises the collective responsibility that you have as a board for leading the organisation, that the values of the trust are being reflected in the running of the trust and in the way that the board is operating, and that you as board members have the necessary commitment and time to commit to ensuring good governance. The third area is integrity. So this is around promoting public confidence and always acting in the best interests of the trust and ultimately its pupils as the beneficiaries. Also important here is dealing with and managing conflicts and conflicts of interest. The fourth area is decision-making, risk and control. And this theme comes across very strongly in the Academy's Trust Handbook. It covers the framework for decision-making, monitoring the work that the trust does, clear delegation and internal control frameworks, and it refers to the risk management and audit and assurance. The fifth area is board effectiveness, and this is something that the DFE focuses on as well. It includes governance reviews, and the Academy Trust Handbook really emphasises the value of external governance reviews. So looking at how effective is your board, do you have a strong composition, a mix of skill sets, and that also leads into the diversity question. How do you address the diversity of the board? It involves ensuring that you're working as an effective team and that the board is continually learning and developing over time. The sixth area is equality, diversity and inclusion. So aiming for these values to really be embedded into the trust. It's an area that many charities and educational organisations are focusing on at the moment. And the board needs to be assessing how well they're doing in these areas. And transparency in this area is really important. And finally, the seventh area is openness and accountability. This is also emphasised heavily in the DFE's handbook, as we will see later on. And this covers openness and transparency with all of your stakeholders, so ensuring that you have appropriate communication with all of the relevant groups. Moving on to the next slide. So this slide is taken from the DFE's Governance Handbook and Competency Framework for Governance. And you'll see here many of the themes that we saw in the Charity Governance Code are also replicated here. So, for example, the focus on strategic leadership and values, decision-making, strong risk management, and accountability, focusing here on the financial accountability, but also educational outcomes as well. How does the board work to ensure that all of these themes are being met and that you're working effectively as a board? And that evaluation aspect comes through here as well. Moving on to the next slide. So the key document which the other governance codes feed into is the ESFA's Academy Trust Handbook. The latest handbook is effective from the 1st of September 22. And this must be followed by all Academy trusts. So it's very important that all board members are fully aware of the requirements of the Academy Trust Handbook. Many of the areas that I touch on here, we will see later on in our case studies in the webinar, and hopefully that will bring some of these themes to life. So what does the Academy Trust Handbook aim to do? It's ensuring that the board members particularly understand their roles and responsibilities and how that drills down into some of the very specific requirements that the ESFA has in terms of reporting and monitoring the activity of an Academy Trust. So the handbook starts off by setting out these roles and responsibilities and defining them in the context of an Academy Trust. So that includes the members, the trustees, the role of the accounting officer, the chief financial officer and the governance professional, previously known as the clerk. And we'll look in a bit more detail later at about that role in the DFE's clerking competency framework. So last year's Academy Trust Handbook set out that a governance professional must be appointed. And this helps to ensure that there's transparency around the governance arrangements of a trust. And as an Academy Trust, you should be putting details of your governance arrangements on your website and making that really clear to the outside world. Listed next is the Audit and Risk Committee, and this is really relevant for a lot of the audit and financial areas, particularly the audit and risk management side. An Academy Trust must have an Audit and Risk Committee if they have income over £50 million per annum. If the income is below that 50 million threshold, you are allowed to merge that with another committee, for example, the Finance Committee. But where those committees are separate, the Academy Trust Handbook does set out that the chair should not be the same for both committees. The Academy Trust Handbook then goes on to look at accountability and financial requirements. So important that Academy Trusts have an internal control framework and a scheme of delegation, strong financial planning, which includes budgeting and monitoring and reserves management. And that you have systems and procedures in place for procurement that lead to value for money. And this area also covers the setting of executive pay. It also highlights the need for clear and transparent policies in the area of whistleblowing. So if anyone inside or outside of the trust has concerns, that you have those procedures in place. Moving on to the next slide. So continuing with the Academy Trust Handbook, the The other areas to mention where the Academy Trust Handbook is quite prescriptive in terms of what an Academy Trust needs to do. The first area is the requirements around internal assurance and scrutiny. So this is the review of systems and controls by probably someone external to the trust. The 2021 Trust Handbook stressed that this must not be completed by a member of the senior leadership team. And that really should be driven by the Audit and Risk Committee and part of your risk management process. The second point there is risk management, and this is really emphasised in the Academy Trust Handbook. So as board members, making sure that there are strong risk management processes, and this includes areas such as cybercrime. The third point is managing conflicts of interests and related party transactions, and this is a really key area for the ESFA. There are strict rules within the handbook on what transactions need to be reported to the ESFA, and also which transactions need to be approved in advance. So it's really key that board members are aware of these pretty stringent requirements in this area. Then got the ESFA approval of certain types of transactions, and a good example of that is non-contractual severance payments. So if they're over 50,000, you need to seek approval from the ESFA. And there's a very useful table in the handbook that summarises the freedoms and delegations that the Academy Trusts have. The Academy Trust Handbook also covers external audit in terms of the appointment, selection and review of the external auditors. And the final point there is regularity and propriety. So this is part of the review that external auditors do as part of the audit. So the statement made in the accounts by the accounting officer and the auditor's report around regularity and propriety. So the board needs to be ensuring that the use of government funds is appropriate and that there are controls and systems and processes in place around your spending to make sure that it's in line with the expectations of the funder. So that was a very quick run through of the frameworks and documents that will feed into the case studies that we are now going to look at. And I will hand over to Hugh for our first case study.
Thank you very much, Alison. So we're going to start off with our first case study, looking at a growing mat. We've got a couple of case studies for you today. Just to say from the outset, they are both entirely fictional case studies. So no matter how convincing our storytelling, or if some of this sounds familiar, just to reassure you, we've made it all up. They are fictional. The first thing to say on this case study on a growing mat is, hopefully some of the challenges we're exploring here, are common challenges within the sector, and obviously we're seeing so many sort of mats develop at the moment in the sector, and looking for that growth, or having gone through those periods of growth. However, if you're a single Academy Trust, there's still stuff that's relevant for you in here. So don't switch off if you're a single Academy Trust. So just going on to the next slide. This case study is around Freedom Mat, and this trust started in 2015 when 4 local schools decided to join together. And the schools were all performing pretty well at the time. And I think the idea behind the mat is they could see the direction of travel at the time with the school sector, and the direction towards academy trusts, and also towards sort of multi-academy trusts. And there was a sort of feeling that they didn't want to get swallowed up and wanted to be in control of their future by forming this multi-academy trust. But all the schools within the trust were in a good position, and they wanted to have a degree of autonomy over their operation of each of the schools. And this sort of concept of autonomy was quite key in the setting up of the trust, and in the ethos that they put together when setting up the trust. And the CEO of the trust at the start was the head of Flagship School, and he had 0.6 still as head, but 0.4 FTE, so 2 days a week as the CEO of the trust. The chair of the trust was keen on the overall concept and wanted to prove the concept worked for this model of multi-academy trust, and was keen to grow and develop and prove the success of the trust. And with that in mind, the trust did grow over the next few years. So by the 1st of September 2020, it had already grown to 8 schools, a number of primaries in particular joined during that period as individual conversions. And then on the 1st of September 2020, another multi-academy trust, Minomat of 2 schools, joined the trust. And as well as acquiring the 2 schools, there was a good skill set on that academy trust board, and so some of the trustees joined. So 2 trustees, one who actually became the chair of the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee because there was a vacancy going at the time, and then another trustee joined the trustee board. Just a couple of months after that, the trust was hit by a cyber incident, and this hit 3 of the schools and was quite disruptive. There was a data loss that needed to be reported to Information Commissioner. It disrupted the day-to-day operations of those 3 schools. Actually, it didn't impact the entirety of the MAT because the IT systems across the MAT were very disjointed. It just so happened these 3 schools were using the same IT supplier and were connected, so it allowed that impact across the 3 schools of the MAT, but not the entire MAT. But nonetheless, the trustees were concerned by this, and there was quite a sort of fallout as they discussed the implications of this, and they eventually sort of came to the conclusion they needed a central resource for IT, just because the practice was so diverse across the trust. They couldn't convince themselves that the risks were being managed across the whole trust without someone leading on this project from a central point of view. They also had problems with the RPA claims. So the RPA does have insurance against cyber, but there are certain things you need to do in order to make those claims, such as training for staff. And whilst they felt that training had occurred on the large part, sort of proving that was an issue, and it was probably at best patchy across the trust. But they did eventually manage to get that claim, but it was a bit of a stressful process. By March 21, this trust was back on the up again. Flagship School had just had an Ofsted visit, and it hadn't been visited since 2007. So they were all worried about this Ofsted visit, and it got outstanding in 2007 and got regraded outstanding in 2021. So the CEO was naturally delighted at this. Given where he was in his career, he was not likely to have to go through another Ofsted visit, so could leave with his head held high ultimately, and the trust was naturally very proud of this and was publicising the success of the trust. Later in that year, the chair of the Finance Audit Risk Committee had got their feet under the table and was raising quite a series of questions about their role and the role of the committee, and made a number of recommendations, which were made sort of initially internally to the chair on how the trust was run, particularly, for example, from the CFO, who was providing information to the committee. But she felt a lot of the information was really just them trying to coordinate and pull together the information across the school, and they didn't think the CFO was really in command of the situation and able to discharge their duties as CFO of the trust, and that theme was sort of mirrored across a number of areas and made and so she made quite a number of recommendations of things that she felt needed doing really for her and her committee to discharge their responsibilities. The trust chair listened to this and was very open to the discussion and open door, but ultimately this got quite political, and there was a lot of struggle to sort of get any momentum behind this, and I think fundamentally because it conflicted with the way that the trust had come together on an autonomous basis, and what she was being seen to do was trying to centralise and change the sort of agreement that the trust came together on. So it really didn't gain much momentum at that point. Separately, then in September, and the other trustee who joined from Minomat, who was more on the education side, was an Ofsted inspector, having been delighted at the outstanding result at Flagship, had decided to go elsewhere in the MAT and visit some of the schools as part of her getting to know the trust, and went to Sovereign Primary School, which was one of the schools that joined in that period up to 2020, and they were suddenly very alarmed at what she saw. So the practices at the school were well below standard and across a whole range of areas, whether this was for onboarding staff, which was causing safeguarding concerns, practices around procurement and just the culture that was set around standards and compliance within the school. Following this visit, this was discussed with the board, and the board was took this very seriously and followed up with a number of further a much closer deep dive on this school to establish what was going on and what was what needed to happen. Ultimately, there was a lot more that came out, and there was a reportable incident that came out of it as well, and they had to move the head of the school on and take a bit of action at the trust level to deal with that. Following this, also, it was coming to the autumn and the time for the statutory accounts. This was the sort of end of the audit process, and the Finance and Audit Risk Committee was meeting at the end of November to discuss the accounts. But then when it came to circulation, they found that the accounts weren't ready to be circulated and didn't manage to hit the Finance Audit Risk Committee's deadlines for that. So the chair was very concerned by this, partly for hitting the deadlines, but partly, as you can imagine, being a new chair, you feel a bit insecure that they weren't going to be able to hit their first audit. So she sat down with the CFO and tried to figure out the reasons for this, and there was a number of explanations. The growth of the MAT and the MAT joining during the period had caused extra complications, and there was a lot of blame put on the auditors who hadn't delivered. But given the severity of the situation, she decided she really needed to get under the skin of this quite a bit more, and spend a lot of time sort of trying to unpick this and what the reasons were behind it. And what she concluded was that the auditors seem to have a lot of responsibility in the process, in terms of they seem to maintain the fixed asset register. There didn't seem to be an ownership of the accounts through the finance function and the CFO, and it was the auditors who seemed to know why the numbers were what they were, and she was trying to get to the bottom of issues, and she was thinking, how is the auditor getting to the bottom of these issues if I can't? So there's a lot of concerns raised at that point. As she was unpicking this, what emerged, that there was a big adjustment going through the accounts, and the adjustment was all relating to funds. It turned out that there had been a lot of capital projects going through the trust, and they'd sort of transitioned from a number of SIF projects going through to the SCA funding over recent years, and now these projects have settled down. It turned out that a lot of revenue funding had and capital funding had been mixed up. So whereas there should have been more funds sitting in the capital fund, they were sitting in the revenue fund. So although cash was just about okay in the trust, and they've been monitoring cash flows, obviously because academies are funded in advance, the cash had been okay, but the reserves had evaporated, and it turned out that some of the schools had been making deficits, and this was getting absorbed by capital funds incorrectly. They tried to unpick all this, which was very messy, and there was quite a bit of back and forth with the local governing bodies as well, both on this and the sovereign primary issue. Of whose responsibility this was to sort of monitor this, and why hadn't people performed their roles. But there was a sort of bit of blame back and forth, and a bit of lack of clarity on what was central and what was the responsibility of the local governing body. But with all of this going on, they didn't hit their ESFA filing deadline, and this and the sovereign primary issue put them firmly on the regulators' radar, who started coming in and asking questions. So although the accounts did get ultimately filed in February the following year, the trustees had to do quite a significant action plan to resolve all of this. The trust did ultimately survive all of this situation. And this was partly due to the strength of some of the trustees within the MAT and responding to this, getting an action plan together. But in order to survive it, there were a number of significant changes that happened within the trust. They recruited a new CEO, so the head of flagship went back to being a head and ceased their role as CEO. They strengthened got in a new CFO for the trust. They strengthened the internal audit function and had a pretty fierce internal auditor who dealt with compliance across the trust. They went to gag pooling because of the severe financial situation. Things had to be tightly managed from the centre, and the delegation of authority got heavily restricted. And whilst the trust survived and they ultimately managed to, keep things on track in a lot of ways for the schools, the reflection was that this really was exactly the opposite of what they went into when trying to form a MAT. They wanted, freedom and autonomy in order to, get the best and most innovative and experience for the children across the MAT. And what they were found now was a very highly centralised and controlling MAT, which was not what they were seeking. So that's the case study of Freedom MAT. So let's unpick a few things from then. So over on my next slide, I'm going to look at the governance professional. This may sound like an odd place to start because I haven't actually mentioned governance professionals through that whole case study. I think what we probably found if we looked at governance professional in Freedom MAT is that they would have had someone there who was responsible for sending agendas and minuting meetings, etc. But that governance professional probably didn't have the strongest role within the trust. And the role of the governance professional is set out. There's a clerk and competency framework, which I've got a screenshot of there on the screen, and they can really support the chair and the chairs of the subcommittees in making sure that the right information and papers go to the committee, and that the right business is dealt with in line with best governance practices across the board and the various subcommittees. Things like risk management and other factors which would you would hope in these situations have prompted a bit more questioning and process around some of the things that came out as a surprise within this MAT if they've been working closely with a strong governance professional. So important role within the trust. On my next slide, just looking at some of those key relationships within the trust. There are a lot of key relationships from a governance perspective, and this isn't all of them, but just wants to highlight on this map what we've seen is this sort of thing around autonomy or centralisation, which is often a big conversation in trusts, and people have different approaches and views to all of that. But I think probably what we're seeing in this trust is, because of the overall ethos of the trust was based on autonomy, they sort of lacked flexibility, and particularly as the trust was changing and evolving, the trust didn't have the flexibility to respond to some of that and to put processes it needed in place to manage its risks ultimately and continue succeeding as a trust. The CFO in this case was deliberately very weak. I mean, almost the CEO was encouraging a weak CFO that was effectively just sort of adding up and aggregating things to try and get the financial reporting sorted, as opposed to sort of leading on the finances of the trust, which was largely delegated into the individual schools. The CEO was relatively happy, with their own patch of land and flagship, and so the relationship with the chair wasn't that strong either. And because of the weakness of these relationships and everyone essentially just doing their own thing, they weren't adequately informed. The chair and the CEO weren't picking up some of the issues on the finances side, or asking questions that would have revealed to them that there were significant issues in the trust. So they were getting to a situation at the end of the sort of attitude of, why didn't anyone tell me this? But they hadn't invested in those relationships and being able to ask those questions, to find out those things for themselves in the process. That little triangle can be very important to for the success of the trust and managing risk. Just over on the next slide. The Academy Trust Handbook. I always include this slide in my case studies. There's often, when things go wrong in a trust, there's some lack of adherence to the Academy Trust Handbook. In this case, I wonder how much lack of adherence there was to the Academy Trust Handbook. I think probably what you'd find in a trust like this is they do actually tick a lot of the boxes. It may not be perfect, but they probably do tick a lot of the boxes within the Academy Trust Handbook. And I think probably what you'd see is that it was very much a box ticking exercise. We do this, we do an audit, etc. But the spirit of what the handbook's trying to get to is not embraced at the trust, and people are seeing it very much as a compliance exercise rather than really thinking about risks and assurance and good governance in their day-to-day. So I think for this trust, it's not necessarily a case of failure to comply, it's a failure to engage in some of the sort of key principles of good governance within the handbook. Just over on the next slide, just talking about visibility, really. How, as a trustee, governor, subcommittee member, whatever it is, do you get a view of what's going on and make sure that you're in the loop and you don't miss key risks? So just a couple of concepts here. The first is on triangulation. So where do you get your information from as a trustee? A lot of the information you get from reporting from the executive. They tell you about all areas of the trust, and they're reporting to board meetings in the papers they present in the challenge that you give them. But you can't take it all just from the executive. You've got to have that independent reporting. So this could be from internal, external auditors or other sources that are independent that you get reported to. But it's also what you see for yourself. Actually, in this situation, quite a lot of the ways that things were uncovered was from people seeing it for themselves and realising things weren't quite as they were hoping. So one thing to sort of review is, how much visibility do you have, and have you got the right sources of information for you to be able to triangulate and see those issues. 3 lines of defence. So people may have heard of this sort of concept and model, but this is basically the lines of defence that Academy Trust has in order to make sure that controls and processes are working as they should be. And a lot of this is done via sort of day-to-day internal controls. So controls over when you onboard staff to manage risks around staff and safeguarding, controls around authorising invoices, etc. for transactional financial controls. And these are strong internal controls will protect you if they are operating correctly against most day-to-day issues, but obviously some of the controls don't operate correctly, and there's an element of monitoring and reporting that needs to go on as your second line of defence to make sure that things are happening as they should be. But even with that monitoring and reporting internally, sometimes that goes wrong, and it's useful to get that independent view. So often things like internal audit or things like external audit, other eyes on the Academy Trust that give you an independent view to make sure that those things that you're being told are happening within the Academy Trust are happening. So again, in this case, a lot of these things were only partially happening or not happening as they should be within the trust, and the trustees didn't have a full view, and certainly that third line of defence was quite weak. The auditors were really bogged down in the numbers of the accounts rather than the sort of scrutiny and challenge that the auditor can bring to flag up where issues may be arising within the trust. So I think that's everything from my case study. So I'm going to hand over now to Catherine to look at financial management challenges.
Thank you, Hugh. So yes, for this sort of final part of the session, we are going to look at another fictitious case study, and as Hugh said, it is completely made up. And in this case, it is a trust facing financial pressures, so really focusing more just on the financial aspects of governance here and the responsibilities there. So we will look at some of the challenges that were faced by the trust and then how the way in which they dealt with these led to some failings, and then move on to some sort of best practice points at the end.
So if we can move on to my first slide, this sort of sets the scene to the case studies. So just to tell you a little bit about this trust, and I haven't given it a name, I'm afraid, but this is in terms of background, this is a sort of established trust. It has a long-serving head. They've been involved with the trust for quite a while and were responsible for sort of turning the trust around in terms of educational outcomes. So they've managed to get it to its current Ofsted rating of good, which was a really sort of good result for this trust given where it came from. The finance director or CFO and the rest of the senior management team report into the head, and this is a head that has a very sort of strong leadership style, shall we say. And then the chair of the board is also long-serving in that role and was involved in the sort of period of turning the school around, and has a very sort of strong and close relationship with the head. So in terms of the sort of finances of the school, in terms of the background there, they have sort of tended to break even as a trust. There hasn't sort of been any particular concerns in the past there, but they don't have a very sort of formal or sort of thought through reserves policy. This hasn't really been an area of focus. I suppose they haven't felt the need to focus on it in the past. And similarly, procedures around risk management policies here, not particularly sophisticated. So there is a sort of risk register document. This was compiled, but it doesn't sort of have that feel of a kind of active document that's kind of regularly engaged with by the executive or the board. A while back, they had a plan approved and secured funding for some significant investment in the building, and this was to allow capacity for expansion to the early years provision. And also a while back, there was the appointment of a new internal auditor. So a new internal audit firm came on board, and as part of their sort of first cycle of reviews, a couple of the reports that were produced were one on procurement processes and then another one on budgeting and financial reporting. And actually both of these raised some significant concerns, things that hadn't been raised previously with the sort of previous internal scrutiny arrangements that were in place. These were duly considered by the audit committee at the time, and they were sort of added to a kind of outstanding audit actions log, as it were. So coming on now to sort of more recent times, there is the retirement of the chair of the finance committee, and in order to replace this role, the trust decides to sort of recruit externally. So they go out specifically to recruit a new trustee with that relevant sort of financial experience to take on this role. So the new chair of the finance committee comes on board, and I suppose as part of his onboarding, getting up to speed and with the trust and getting to know what's been going on, he's obviously looking at recent minutes, accounts, financial information, and so on. And he also specifically is picking up on those concerns raised by the internal audit reports, and in particular is a bit alarmed, I suppose, by the findings from the budgeting and financial reporting review. So he looks into this in a bit more detail, and because he isn't satisfied, I suppose, with what he is seeing in terms of actions and what the trust has been doing to address these points, then he does request a sort of a further forensic review of the financial reporting and budgeting, and in particular he also wants this capital project to be looked at in a bit of detail. So this goes underway, and as a result of that, there are some sort of significant findings coming out of that sort of forensic review. So with regards to capital projects, this is running quite significantly over budget, and what has been happening is that the sort of cash flow, I suppose, for this kind of additional spend has been taken from unrestricted funds. Also, the sort of increased utility and running costs that are going to sort of accrue, I suppose, as a result of the expansion to the building. It's found that this hasn't been factored in to those budgets and forecasts. The assumptions for the additional income from the expansion in this provision are found to be quite optimistic. Whereas actually on the other side, the kind of additional cost base, in particular things on the staffing side, because of the increased ratios that are needed, hasn't been fully budgeted for. And indeed, really across the board, the kind of increases in expenditure that have been factored into the budget are found to be, I suppose, too low for the current environment. So really a number of concerns coming out of that forensic review, which once they're sort of actioned and sort of reworked into the finances, it comes out with a sort of forecast deficit on the unrestricted funds position of the trust. So of course this needs to be notified to the ESFA. It also then has an implication for the financial statements at the year end in terms of the going concern assessment and what impact that would have on the external audit of the financial statements, and also on the regularity side. This raises their concerns around whether the board has been exercising adequate financial oversight. So quite a few points coming out of that review. So if we move on to the next slide, and really just to have a sort of unpick the case study a little bit and think about maybe what went wrong or what other things could have been thought about in this example. And as I said, it is fictitious, but it hopefully can help illustrate, you know, really how important it is to have that effective governance oversight and really making sure that the financial information that you're presented with, the audit findings that you're provided with are properly sort of interrogated and challenged in a timely manner. So in this case study, there is that sort of implication of the sort of strong leadership style or sort of strong personality of the head. So really is it the case there maybe that the SMT don't maybe challenge or raise concerns maybe that could be seen to sort of put an obstacle in the way of the plans? There's the implication there possibly, and this is obviously going back to what Hugh was talking about earlier in terms of some of those key relationships. Another key relationship there is implied that the head and the chair are sort of very close, and does that maybe deter proper challenge of the executive by the rest of the board? Maybe it seems to be that it is only when this new chair of finance comes on board that they start to ask more questions and maybe look into things in a little bit more detail. So if we look at some of the points on the slide here in turn, so first the quality of financial reporting and budgeting and forecasting. And the scenario here is that the trust has traditionally been able to break even. There sort of hasn't been any immediate significant financial pressures. So, you know, perhaps the quality of the financial information presented to the board maybe wasn't challenged as much in as much detail as it might have been otherwise, or if there had been more pressures. So in particular, following the forensic review, it was clear that the capital project hadn't been monitored sufficiently. So I'm sure at the sort of initial planning stage, there was a project budget that was probably put together, assessed in detail before it was approved, before it went through and obtained funding. But this then wasn't monitored sufficiently on an ongoing basis, and costs were then allowed to escalate without actually raising the appropriate red flags. So what sort of things as board members should you be looking out for and asking as part of your review of management accounts and forecasts that you receive? So are management accounts and budgets presented in a way that are understandable? So in this example, you'd probably want to see separate financial reporting on the capital project so that you could keep track maybe of operational and capital spend separately if this was quite significant, and so that you were clear that you're sort of not drawing down or utilising those unrestricted funds without becoming aware of it. Do your financial forecasts include key assumptions and risks and sensitivity analysis? So in this case, you probably wanted to have further detail around the assumptions with regards to the business model for the early years provision, for example, and some sensitivity analysis there if, the income didn't hit the sort of core assumption targets. Are you provided with information to enable you to understand whether the risks that you have identified are materializing? So this is where the ongoing monitoring comes in. So it is really useful to have KPIs that you look at, or maybe have variance thresholds within your sort of budget to actuals, because these can help identify red flags and risks coming down the line in a timely way, and therefore enable decision making at the appropriate point before it is too late. Is there information on the level of income and expenditure uncertainty provided, and is there enough flexibility within the budget or the forecasting model to then take account of that uncertainty? So here there was the case of unrealistic inflation assumptions, for example, or increased utility costs, and then there was no tolerance really in the budget to sort of absorb any of those. So in summary, is there sufficient information that's provided to the board to understand the basis for the budgets that they approve, the risks within those budgets, and then the information monitoring throughout the year to sort of understand the actual versus what's been approved, and are any of those risks kind of happening and crystallising? If we look at sort of tendering and procurement, and the example here doesn't go into any detail on the trust procurement processes or indeed what the failings were that were identified by the internal auditor. I mean, we can speculate. There's reference to the capital project, and this is going significantly sort of over time and over budget. And while that's probably not unusual in the current climate, it doesn't mean that it isn't an area of concern. So while I'm sure that there was an appropriate procurement and value for money exercise carried out at the outset of the project, I suppose it could be implied that the monitoring of this ongoing project or any variations to the contract weren't sufficiently challenged. There is also the reference to the significant increases to the ongoing operational expenditure not having been factored into the budget. So again, this could pose the question of how effectively are these ongoing contracts monitored and reviewed to ensure you're obtaining the best value for money. And there is no mention in the case study of conflicts of interest, but as I'm on this heading, I will just mention it here because it does come up time and again in the ESFA investigation reports as a failing in the procurement process. So really important that you're aware of what those potential conflicts of interest are by completing declarations of interest, making sure that those registers are published, and that management are aware of those conflicts of interest as well, as it is them involved in the procurement exercises. And then if we look at the key management personnel, and in the case study here, we had the long established sort of strong head, the close relationship with the chair. And as I said, the implication that maybe the head's performance, and that of the executive possibly not sufficiently challenged by the board. There's also a question maybe around the CFO and whether they had the required skills for the role. In particular, I suppose, given the findings from the forensic review, it seems to be that quite a number of issues obviously came about as a result of that. So is that a skills issue, or is it a sort of a relationship issue, as in the example that Hugh talked about earlier, and just the relationship between the CFO and the head? And then looking at the board effectiveness, there's a suggestion here that the board and the committees aren't providing sufficient challenge to the executive, or indeed haven't been asking enough questions of the assurance providers, either the internal auditors. So they're noting findings, but just adding them to sort of an action log. So a bit of a tick box exercise again. And it's not until the new chair of finance comes on board that things start to be followed up. So if as a board you're not presented with good enough quality financial information, KPIs that enable you to monitor performance, you should be asking why not, or you should be asking for that additional information. It is sometimes just as important to sort of have a think and ask about what's missing as to actually having a look at what has been presented to you and what you do have in your papers. It's also really important to kind of sense check those assumptions in the financial projections with other sources. So in this example, the sort of early years provision sort of income projections, what were they based on? Does that make sense with what you know about demographics in the area, for example, local competition, that sort of thing? And there's also the reference about there not being a formal reserves policy, the sort of risk register being a bit of a tick box sort of exercise, whereas really you would expect these to be very much live documents, very interlinked indeed, sort of, you know, risk management and reserves, in particular in the current environment. So this does ask the question as a board, how are they fulfilling their responsibilities around risk management and managing public funds if they're not very alive to these points. So just turning to my final slide, taking on board some of the failings from the sort of example scenario, I've just summarised what I see as opposed to some best practice points which would be important for trustees involved in governing an academy trust as they fulfil their duties. So financial oversight, really at its core, this is about challenge and appropriate questioning, as we've been talking about. So management accounts, forecasts, these are key, but you do need to be understanding them and challenging them sufficiently. So do you have all of the figures that you need to draw a conclusion about the financial position and performance of the trust and the future outlook? And if not, then ask those questions. Are you aware of all major projects, sort of staffing issues, what that might mean for costs going forward? Do you understand what's happening with the revenue reserve, so the unrestricted funds and relative to income and expenditure? And if you're in a MAT scenario, do you have that understanding at a school level? And if there are any issues or any imbalances in the budget, have these been identified? Are there plans to address them? Are the plans viable? Can they happen in a timely manner? Any sort of variances in the sort of budgets versus actuals? Could any of these be reflective of any irregularity or any kind of sort of red flags, I suppose, with regards kind of deteriorating financial health? And then looking at the policies and processes point, obviously compliance with the trust handbook, as we've heard, is a requirement. So there's all the must requirements that must be part of your policies and processes, and the should requirements you should be considering. You should be reviewing these at least annually to ensure compliance with the handbook. But as we heard from Hugh, it's more than that. It's not just a tick box exercise. Are these policies continue to be most appropriate and effective for this type and size of trust you've become, for the way that you operate, and so on, and the ongoing projects that you're running? And all of this obviously looked at in the context of risk. So has the risk register risk assessment identified any particular areas of weakness or concern within the financial management structure? If so, then what are the plans to address this? So are you is there internal scrutiny or a deep dive required? For example, this forensic review that we saw in the example, maybe additional training for members of staff, or indeed if there's a particular skills gap, then hiring of new staff and kind of rebalancing that structure there. And yeah, this sort of links through to that sort of 3 lines of defence model that we heard about earlier. So really just on this slide, a few sort of best practice points to sort of think about and take forward as part of your governance role. So that was everything I wanted to cover this afternoon, and I'll now just hand back to Hugh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that case study, another interesting one. And just to highlight, you know, we do have a lot of further sort of resources and updates for Academy Trust. So, for example, we've got guidance that's available on our website on setting reserves policies for Academy Trusts, and we're currently producing our next benchmarking report for financial benchmarking for Academy Trust. That will be coming out in the next couple of months, as well as having our usual programme of seminars and webinars, including our Academy Accounts Workshop, our annual Academies update, and new to this year, a session on the role of the accounting officer and their responsibilities as accounting officer. I think in terms of questions, we'll cover those via email, so we'll draw the session to a close now. But as I said, we will be issuing both the recording of the session and the slides via email after this session. But really just remains me to say thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's session, and thank you for listening.